Well, good afternoon and welcome to this episode of the Learning for Justice Summer Read Along series. This episode is titled The Power of Justice in the South and Beyond. I'm Crystal Keels. I'm an editor for Learning for Justice, and I'm thrilled to introduce our guest panelists today. We have Amber N. Mitchell from the Whitney Plantation, Lolita Bolden from SPLC, the project manager from the Mississippi State Office, and the director of Learning for Justice, Jalaya Liles Dunn. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few things. I'm going to ask listeners to use the Q&A box in Zoom rather than the chat so that we can monitor your questions. Closed captioning is also available during the show. This session is being recorded and the link will be available later on the LFJ website. So the purpose of our read along this afternoon is to gain a deeper understanding not only of the work that's presented here, but the work behind the work that's featured in the most recent issue of Learning for Justice magazine. So we want to achieve a deeper understanding of the articles themselves, provide suggestions for implementation in classrooms or in your home, provide an opportunity to build community and broaden the LFJ audience. So I thank you all for being here. And I am delighted to introduce today's authors. And we'll start with Amber. Amber, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are right now in the world. I'm Amber Mitchell. I am the Director of Education here at Whitney Plantation. If you're unfamiliar with Whitney, we are a 18th century sugar plantation turned historic site just outside of New Orleans, Louisiana, in the small descendant communities of Wallace and Edgar. And we are dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of slavery in the United States from the perspective of enslaved people. My background, I'm a trained historian, public historian, based in New Orleans, but originally from Detroit, Michigan. Have degrees from Wayne State University and Indiana University, but has really specialized in doing this kind of work, in translating these really difficult historical topics in museum spaces and working in museum education. So it's been really exciting to be able to lead that effort here at Whitney Plantation, but also to be able to write an article focusing in on the work that we do at Whitney, especially how we can be best allied with educators and learners of all ages. So thank you, LFJ, for the invitation.
Thank you, Amber. And let's have Lolita introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lolita Bolden, born and raised here in Mississippi in a little rural town called Utica. I currently serve as project manager here at the Mississippi State Office of SPLC. I am really delighted to be a part of LFJ's Summer Read Along. I actually add capacity to the Mississippi State Office and its efforts to collaboratively address issues that occur in each region of our state to drive long-term change and transform communities. My experiences include cultivating relationships, providing tools and resources to emerging leaders, facilitating civic engagement programs aimed at increasing participation of underserved communities and in the electoral process. So I am really glad to be here and thank you for the invitation, LFJ.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Lolita. And now, Jalaya, could you tell us about yourself, please?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jalaya Liles Dunn, the Director of Learning for Justice. I am from the South Carolina specifically, and I come here from work dealing with justice, dealing with equity, and it's all of them been in spaces of education. I have a political science background, so I've always studied how systems work, how we dismantle systems, and how we build systems of hope, and how do we rebuild, and how do we gain, and how we put power in places that where power deserves to be and should always have been to tap into that power. And so this specific and topic today, a power of place, is so exciting because this is the type of work, this is what I came to do. This is the work I've been doing. And so being here at Learning for Justice and SPLC is an honor. And being on this panel, I'm even more excited about. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Each one of you has focused on the power of place in your articles. Amber, you wrote Survival, Resistance, and Resilience about honest history at the Whitney Plantation. Lolita, you're featured in Where I'm From, which is the Why I Serve section of the Learning for Justice magazine. And Jalaya, of course, your perspective column opens the magazine every issue. So I'm delighted to have you all here. Let's start with Jalaya. Because your article opens the conversation of this issue. You write about the nexus of power, justice, and place, and state that power is in the autonomy of local people. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
One thing, power is the word I use a lot. That this is where we tap into the power, tap into our own collective power. What we can do together determines how we change and shape what justice looks like for all of us and for ourselves, for our families, for those that are things that are personal and important to us. Whoever holds the power determines the future, determines the history and the future. And so we have to be very clear to let communities, particularly in the South and local communities, you have the power. It was meant for you not to know that you have the power, but you have the power to shape how this looks, whether it's through elections, whether it's through how we shape our communities and demand what we need, how do we demand what justice looks like, but we get to shape it. And unfortunately, so many times, the most people who hold systems and who hold power, who maintain power, use that type of vantage point to keep others not thinking they are powerless, to make people think you don't know anything. But collectively, when we sit and understand what we can change and shape together, it's magnificent. It's revolutionary, and it's up to us to continue to remind folk that you have it, you always had it, but we got to show you how to tap into it and how to use it, how to wield it so that it changes and shapes the way you should be living and make you a meaningful part of society in the way that you deserve to be a part of society. And so that's where this power conversation comes in play, of like, this is in place and it is already there, and it's with the people, and it's with the people who understands justice more than anything. So that's when I talk about power in place and what it looks like for a local autonomy and what it feels like and why it's so connected to the autonomy of the people in the local space.
Thank you for that. Amber, that leads me to think about your piece. And Jalaya mentioned revolutionary. The work that you do at Whitney is revolutionary in that it provides a narrative that is rarely told. If you'd like to share some of that, for example, why is it important, and I know that you do this on site, to change our language around slavery to being a foundation of the modern world?
Sure. And thank you, Jalaya, for giving that great introduction to power, because ultimately history and history education, history is a practice of power. Who gets to tell a story? Who has their story preserved? Who gets to be told that they're the hero in the story and who's the villain? And most importantly, whose story is forgotten and whose story isn't seen as valuable. And so in working at a literal plantation that has been in existence since 1752, that has turned into an educational space to transform how we as individuals, as community members, as members of the larger society, and as a larger globe, members of our larger global community, this gives us a place and a space to be thinking about power historically and who has created the wealth that has allowed for our world to be, especially in Western context. And so a lot of that power also begins with language, right? And how we talk about people, both people historically, people today, and people in the future. And so at Whitney, we choose deliberately to use person-centered language when we're speaking about enslaved people. So slave is a title. It's not who that person is, who that person was, who that person could have and should have been. That was just the title given to them by someone who stole their power away. So whenever possible here, we use names, because again, a major part of giving people power back in death is giving them their name back whenever we know it. And if not, we make sure that we're using that person first. That person is the most important part of the conversation, because ultimately the people who lived, worked, labored here, when I say labor, mentioning both physical, emotional, mental, and reproductive in the case of women, are literally how and why American society, and honestly, global Western society, has been able to grow. And so we explore that a lot via our education tours here at Whitney, and it's a wonderful experience to be able to talk to 5th through 12th graders and reshape how they think about power, especially when it comes to enslaved people and to themselves.
Thank you for that. And Lolita, you talk about the power of community in your piece and also offer us a gorgeous poem. If you all haven't had a chance to read that, please do yourself a favor and visit Lolita's work. But Lolita, you talk about the power of community in your piece, and you make it explicit how community empowers you and the work of individuals, and how your desire is to help other people. Can you speak to that for us, please?
Sure. I'll start by saying, own your power, since we're talking about power. And power comes from within, and it has its benefits. We all possess the potential ability to influence, to persuade, and to educate. So we want to focus our attention on what we're good at and lean into that to help move causes forward. And I'll say, when thinking about power and place, reflect upon your own beliefs. These are those instilled things within us by our family, our friends, and our community and culture. And volunteer, because after you've done your homework, and we do need to do our homework, we need to study the landscape and know the causes. Don't just stand on the sideline and watch. Bring what you know and your resources that you have to the table without taking over. And show up when you're invited to participate, because of your expertise and your experiences, because of your leveraged relationships and your affiliations and your ability to get things done. Spring into action. Sometimes, depending upon what the situation is, you don't want to wait to be invited. Show up and ask how you can be of assistance.
Thank you for that. Let's see. Let's talk about ways that we can assist teachers, students, young people, and anyone actually in the community with some of the work that we have offered. For example, Amber, you talk about some of the challenges, or ask about some of the challenges that historic sites like Whitney can assist teachers and students in combating. Can you speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. So obviously, talking about very difficult subjects such as slavery can lead to a lot of different emotions and lots of different feelings from all kinds of people, both the students who are possibly learning it for the first time, and to the adults who are either listening, assisting the students in guiding through that conversation, or first-time learners themselves. And so there's a certain power that comes with being in a space, in a place where these histories happen. And so luckily at Whitney Plantation, we offer that kind of space to be able to step into what a enslaved workers cabin would have, be able to step into that place, to be able to step into the detached kitchen where people were creating some of the most iconic dishes that make Louisiana, Louisiana, right? And so, being able to offer that context, essentially, is something that museums, but especially museums that are rooted in challenging histories, but the histories of people who have not been centered in the story of America can offer. So empowering our students and learners of all ages to create context, to be able to make connection to past, to present, to future. Encountering that physical space is always important. Museum education is a natural partner of teachers and formal educational spaces. The only reason that we are in existence is to make sure that that translation between a museum and its very prominent primary sources are accessible to teachers and students. That's why we exist. So even if you don't have a Whitney Plantation in your area, I'm sure that there are other institutions or culture bearers who can help make that connection for you in the meanwhile, before you can get to a larger institution. And most importantly, we help people understand how primary sources work, how to read through a primary source, how to read an environment, but most importantly, how to remind everyone that people are people, past, present, and future, and every emotion, every thought, every like, dislike, messiness that you have, people in the past had as well. And it is our duty to be able to share that information with others. So I hope that answers that question.
Absolutely. Jalaya, let's turn to you. Amber talked about helping people make connections, and you make a connection in your perspectives column that people don't normally make, and that is the connection between the North and South reconciling after the Reconstruction era. Why is it important to understand the significance of that reconciliation and that connection?
You got to know the truth, right? We have to know the truth. You have to know that the narrative that's been painted is not a true narrative. That's not the true story. It's not the South is bad and North is good. That's trivial, that's surface, and that's not what this is about. It's just what Amber said. Know the full story here. And the full story is this. This is a nation that has been built on white supremacy, and everyone benefits, whether you're North, South, East, or West. And so everyone plays a role, and know how these systems work, know how systems of control work, know how it's all coordinated. I'm so sorry, but my 3-year-old wants to be in this conversation with us today. And I apologize to all of you. I can't get rid of her. But know how these systems are coordinated. Know that the South may have been producing the actual direct labor on site in some places. Doesn't mean the North wasn't either. But understand that North needed power to maintain in a certain way. So they've made a deals with each other. Everyone was cutting deals. So it's not this was the good side. There's no good and evil in white supremacy. It is all working together to uphold one system of power and different systems of control. And that's why I love that you brought that up, that we have to be honest with ourselves so we can understand how power and justice moves along and how power is positioned in certain places too, which is in the South in one way, but it was always positioned in the North as well. So understanding how that cooperation and that partnership works, you can understand what we're looking at now today. We may see certain southern states upholding legislation and policy changes that are really hindering the social and emotional health and the history teaching and honest history in the United States. But please believe there are other states across the nation that's going to uphold that and continue this model, this system of control along the way. So it's just a strategy. It's a strategy, and it's all coordinated together. We have to understand that. And if we want to understand how to dismantle it and how to rebuild a system of power that coordinates and works and opens for everyone.
And that leads me to ask you another question, and it also relates to what Lolita has shared. That is, and I totally lost it. Okay. It has to do with our shared liberation, right?
Yes.
What must securing and guarding our shared liberation look like because of the connection that we all have?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Crystal. I think it's my favorite one. This is the one I want to preach day in and day out. If we fall for the racial bribe or the wealth bribe or whatever bribe that is put forth to us, because this is old games, same trick, old game. It's the same model. It's the same snake, new skin. If we fall for the racial bribe, we are pushing ourselves back years and years and years and years beyond progress of racial justice. We have to understand that it's not my group gets it and it hurts another group. We all are victims. We all are we are not a part of the top 1%. We're all not benefit from this. My otherness is compared to your otherness, and it's all meant to separate us. If we come together and build collective power, we have shaped and changed the direction of this nation in such a significant way. We have to understand the power we hold together as a collective of different, diverse, beautiful people who have different histories, different stories, different orientations to sexuality, different ways, colors and hues and sounds and accents and nation, just everything, origins. If we use that power and our own identities to bring together this kind of rich, diverse way of living and working together, we've shaped this nation in the way it should have been when we wrote this, when this Constitution was written, and where this nation could go and what democracy truly means. And so that is why this shared liberation is so important. This is ours together. This is a story of us. And we're in a moment of now, in the moment of urgency. So if I leave with anything, we have to guard our liberation. It is our liberation. It is not yours against mine. There's no such thing. Liberation is liberation. One of us free, all of us are free. And we got to start thinking in that way. White supremacy doesn't allow that. Principles of white supremacy said one of us holds power and everyone else is in bondage. No one is free in the systems of white supremacy, regardless of what the bribe and what the lie and what the guards of and what type of illusion of being a guard of a system looks like. And we have to think in that way and be very critical in that type of thinking.
And I saw that we have a question: how do we avoid the us against them paradigm? And I think, Jalaya, you have just addressed that. Would any, either Amber or Lolita, like to weigh in on that? How we avoid the us against them paradigm when we talk about honest history, when we talk about liberation, when we talk about narratives, right? This is not my narrative, this is our narrative.
Absolutely. And I think at Whitney, what we end up doing is reformatting the history of slavery is not the history of Black people, not the history of Africans in America. It's part of it, yes, but this is a part of a larger American story. The story of slavery doesn't start or end with Black people in America. It's a collective work because it was all part of this white supremacist system that's been created and built upon, right? And so reformulating how we think about, again, that status of a person being a slave rather than a person who is enslaved, thinking about enslaved, well, who enslaved that person? Why were they enslaved? It brings out a larger ability to ask harder questions, which ultimately, when you ask questions, which is what we try to have our students do during their tour, it leads you to start that critical thinking, right? When you start asking the hard questions, white supremacy shakes because it's on a shaky system anyway, right? It's all built on sand. So when you ask the tougher questions, it tends to not be able to hold up very well because it doesn't make sense. And it's always great to see when students are realizing like this whole narrative doesn't make sense, and you can see it in their eyes. And so I would say first starting with the history of slavery is the history of the history of the US, it's the history of our Western world, and it's really the history of the business of human trafficking. This is a business, right? And it's a business that's built on the backs of Africans and the blood of indigenous people. And once you start from there and saying that this is a collective story and not one individual group story, it allows us to combat that us versus them narrative.
And I would add, we have to learn to control our narrative and not allow others to tell our stories. And I think that's how a lot of information gets skewed, because people will tell history from the eyes of themselves and not from where it actually comes from. So.
Thank you for bringing that up, Lolita, because you talk about controlling the narrative. The story that you gave, the story that you provided of the community wherein you were nurtured is one that we don't often hear. And we really appreciate your sharing that. It was incredible how you talked about your father and the work that he did getting people to vote, right? That's a narrative that we don't necessarily pay attention to because we work in what do we call a national discourse that doesn't make us it doesn't shed a light on all the stories that need to be told. So control over the narrative is absolutely important. And it's the community, I think, that helps that narrative keep going. Like you spoke about how your family worked to make sure that the narrative and the importance of helping each other stayed in place. The poem you wrote captures a beautiful picture of what life was like, right, or is like in the South for folks who, a lot of folks never get that beauty, never get to see that beauty. So the control over the narrative is absolutely essential. And that is one of the powerful things about Learning for Justice magazine in and of itself, that we are opening up a narrative to become more inclusive so that we know our real history, so that we know all the stories that took place, not just one controlled narrative. And so that's really, really powerful. I'd like to ask each of you a question about instilling information in young people. What strategies, because there's a question in the chat, what strategies do we endorse to help pass on the narrative to younger people, right? Because it's surprising to me right now to understand that a lot of folks don't comprehend the actual era of the 50s and 60s civil rights movement. How do we make sure that young people are engaged, and what strategies would we use to make sure that those narratives continue?
Well, I'll start by saying, one, you have to educate yourself. This allows you to gain a better understanding of what the issues are, to seek to address those, and learning about how and why they exist. It reminded me of Jalaya's response about systems and why they were created. And when you think about those systems, they are in place to maintain power. And so if there are events that take place that people are trying to take away from you, those are things that we probably should be studying a little bit more, because they are only set in place to remain in power. And when people call on you to address certain issues, then they're calling on you because they think you know. So you have to be able to educate yourself and know a little more history and the basis of why things happen the way that they happen in order to address.
And sites like the Whitney Plantation are perfect for that kind of self-education. Amber, all the work that you do. And speaking of the work that you do, can you talk to us about the Children of Whitney?
Sure. The Children of Whitney statues are an artistic interpretation based upon what our founder, John Cummings, was most interested in. If you've never been to Whitney, probably the most iconic images of us that float around are these small child statues that are throughout the site. They were designed by artist Woodrow Nash, who is based out of Baltimore. And those particular art pieces are striking because in the sense, our founder, who is a retired trial attorney from New Orleans, he really didn't know this history himself, but what brought him into learning more about it when he bought the site in 1999 was thinking about the fact that enslaved people also included children, right? And thinking about how, especially under Louisiana law, at age 10, you're considered an adult. So you have children who are working, living, and toiling in the fields, but also do not have that protection, the same protections that their white counterparts would have had at that same time period. And so for him, as somebody who's family oriented and has lots of children himself, learning more about children allowed him to better connect with this history himself. And so in working with young people directly, what we attempt to do here to try and create the strategies that we use to try and create a space that allows for students to ask questions is, one, being upfront and honestly, and not just saying that we're creating a safe space, but we're creating a brave space. We're going to have a hard conversation today. I'm going to challenge you to ask tough questions. I'm going to challenge you to think maybe a little bit differently than what you may have known before you got here, or even what a family member have told you. But this isn't a space that we're going to be pointing blame. This isn't a space where we're going to make you feel bad or attempt to make you feel bad for some unknown reason. We're here to ask hard questions, because the very least we can do to challenge narratives is to ask tough questions. So that's one thing that we do, is creating a brave space. Another thing, of course, we are interpretation with 5th through 12th graders, because when I created this tour, I didn't want to lecture, because that's boring. I mean, we're still a field trip, right? And nobody likes to be sat and lectured at. And so a huge part of our tour is getting the children to ask questions, to ask tough questions, to ask hard questions, to start to make those connections themselves, to be those critical thinkers, because history teaches you to be a critical thinker, ultimately. And then lastly, when we don't know something, we say, I don't know. That's a good question. Let's find out. You know, I think for a lot of people, especially those who work, who are educators, who maybe work in something that they might not necessarily feel comfortable with, we ultimately feel like, oh, well, we have to have the answers for everything. And I'm here to tell you, I say, I don't know constantly. The question is, what do you do to change I don't know to a let's find out? What strategies can we use to connect people back to finding those resources? How do you read in between the lines on primary sources when you don't see the narrative that you're looking for, right? So one of the things that we have on our website is a list of resources that we connect teachers back to for when they leave, or when they come, before they come, but also continuously educating ourselves. So we're constantly self-training, we're constantly reading through and going deeper in our conversations. But those are the 3 strategies that we use at Whitney.
Jalaya, I'd like to ask you, why at this point are these strategies so important?
I don't think we can afford to lose another generation. We have a generation at stake. We have generations waiting, and we're going to lose them. We're going to lose them to another way of life, and they're going to not know their history. They're going to be disconnected from, they're going to be more and more disconnected to the story and the foundation of what this life, what this world, and how they live. So right now you have young people who are experiencing justice and injustice every day. They live it. They don't understand where it comes from, and they begin to think it's them. And this is the way life is. And this is because someone in my family, they believe the story that's been put into them. And that's not okay. And the more and more we allow new generation to keep receiving that, the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We're disconnected more, and they will not be able to stand into their righteous role as a citizen and shape in their part and make their history and their mark in this world and shape history the way others have had a chance to shape history. So we are providing a disservice to young people. We're providing a disservice to their opportunity to shape the world and make the world better, and for us to benefit from that as well. But we can't keep losing another generation. We're losing them each moment, each time. We don't educate, we lose. So we got to keep educating new generations, each young group of young people more and more, because it is to the point we are losing our young people. And our young people are becoming the families. And right now, the parents of our young people were just young people a few years ago. And so we just, the cycle, and we cannot continue a cycle of keeping a community or a population or people oppressed in a certain way, or marginalized in certain ways. We can't continue that. We have to break that cycle. And we have, or we wouldn't be around the screen now. Many of us aren't supposed to be here. All of us shouldn't, if you think about your own stories, we shouldn't be here right now. And so we have to do our part to make sure new generations get their space to shape what the possibilities and potential could be in this world for us. and for themselves.
You said that some folks live in injustice every day. That leads me to Amber. You discussed the Whitney Plantation being in the center of Cancer Alley. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on what it means to be at the intersection of a historic site of subjugation and a current site of climate disaster?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this area between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is home to some of the highest concentrations of cancer in human beings, and not just Louisiana, but in the entire world. And this area is known colloquially as Cancer Alley. You can see all kinds of articles and news pieces out about it recently. The EPA has done large investigations, but this also a lot of these areas are former plantation sites that have been built over by petrochemical plants, right? And so when you have sites of historic harm, as plantations are, or at least in Louisiana context are, that have transformed into being sites that literally are polluting the air that we breathe every day, polluting the water that we drink, polluting the land that we live on, and them also being in the middle of descendant communities, enslaved descendant communities. You have multiple angles of harm, multiple angles of continued disrespect, continued violence amongst particular groups of people. And so ultimately, to be at a historic site that also is on the Louisiana Gulf Coast and is constantly in the cone of uncertainty when it comes to hurricanes, we are at the precipice of possibly losing very important historic sites to all kinds of people, but especially African Americans and Creoles of color in Louisiana and throughout our country. Oftentimes, places that are historically significant for African Americans are the first to be lost, mainly due to demolition by neglect, demolition by lack of care, and of course, demolition by man-made climate disasters. For instance, just a couple of years ago in 2021, we were hit by Hurricane Ida, which was about 175 miles an hour winds that sat over us for 8 hours, and it was extremely bad in this area. There's still blue tarps on people's roofs to this day, and we're, 2 years on. And so it's not a matter of if we're in a climate disaster. It's a matter of when is that climate disaster going to be touching you? And for a lot of our students that come here, thinking about that intersection, especially when it comes to environmental racism and environmental justice issues, which a lot of them care about, Whitney becomes this very interesting intersection for historical racism and modern day harm.
Thank you for that. Lolita, you talked about you do the work that you're engaged in for the benefit of your grandchildren. Looking ahead to the generations to come, right? And so that reminds us that the work that we do today, we may not see the immediate benefits of, but we're doing it to put in place a better world for those who are coming after us. Can you talk about how you connect with your grandchildren about issues such as inclusive democracy? You talk about your father picking up people for voting day, right? So how do you talk to your grandchildren about the importance of continuing that tradition and traditions like that?
It's not so much what I say. I always try to have them mock what I do. So I try to be a great example to them and to others of what I want to see. It would be quite hypocritical for me to tell them to do one thing and I'm doing quite the opposite. And so I carry that along with me. One of the things that I practice is vulnerability. No one has to know every aspect of your life, but people need to know that you are authentic and you are sincere in your dealings. Another thing is to show compassion. We don't show enough compassion in this world. And it's not enough love. And I say that with all due respect. But if we are to make things better for tomorrow, we have to start today. One of the things that I mentioned in my piece was I sit at tables of justice where some were not allowed to pull up a chair. I am served the bread of diversity, equity, and inclusion that others before me prepared, but never tasted. And I drink from a fountain of democracy. And that's something that I carry with me in my heart every day. My 3 grandchildren, Jace, Jacelyn, and Carson, they are 4 and 5 right now. It's incumbent upon me to make sure that I allow them to see me in the light of how I want to see them in the future. And so I practice what I preach.
That's spectacular. And you mentioned love. Jalaya, you mentioned love as well in your piece. Can you please talk to us about the way that you talk about love in your piece?
I want to reread the quote because I don't want to mess up that quote.
I have it for you if you like.
It would be great. What did I say? What's the quote? Could you read?
Sure, yes. I have it underlined. This is inspired by the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love.
So that's the love piece. I put love there because you gotta love each other. You gotta love yourself and your own identity, but then you have to be open to loving the identities and the stories of everyone else and those around you. You can't, because it's not a self-serving love. It's not a love like, oh, we're better, I'm here. This is this whole power conversation. I'm up, you're down, we're the haves, you're the have-nots. It is this love of all. It is this love of us. It is the love of the fabric of all of our stories and narratives and grandmas and intergenerational histories and origins. Is all of that love. If you don't have a love for people and humans and human value, then you cannot use your power to move justice in the right way and to fulfill the cause of justice. It's just not going to be there. So you have to lead this work with love. But I also like the other part of that quote. I'm not sure if I was able to put it in the writing. And it was, I think it was, justice without like power is anemic. Like you have to have, the power comes with it. So you can't just love each other and say, oh, we love each other, we're great. Yeah, you're wonderful. We're going to do this. But you got to stand behind that love. And love means standing up and doing the hard work. Love means having those brave conversations Amber spoke of. Love means modeling like Miss Lolita speaks of so clearly. But love means standing up and fighting. Love isn't passive. And love isn't this beautiful thing that just happens and it feels good. Love is about standing up for what is right. Love is about really pushing justice. And if you care about justice and you want to see a just world, you do it out of love, but you got to do it for love too. And so that's when love takes that's why love is such a central in peace. And I like that piece. But I think I ended the piece with that quote to say that this is what's missing. This is what's missing. So there's a group that's fighting for power. And they are thinking that they are fighting for justice too. You hear the stories, the opposition. We can say, I don't want to do the us versus them, but those who don't think about this work the way we think about this narrative of justice. But what's missing is that they have a love for themselves and their special groups and their own consciousness for themselves. There's not a love for all. And when you love all people, when you love all, whether you may not understand it, you may not know it, and you may not. It's the belovedness of everyone, but if you know, it's the beloved. It's like we have to be together. When you understand the belovedness of being a full community of people, then then you harness your power in the right way, and then justice becomes real for all. And that's how you have to look at love in that way.
That's beautiful. I have a question for all three of you before we run out of time, and that is, what is one of the most important things you want readers and today's listeners to take away from your work? And we can start with Amber, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think primarily what I want people to take away from my article and from the work that I do generally is a reminder that the story of Africans in America does not begin nor end with the story of slavery, but it's an important piece. However, that does not take away from the fact that these people lived and loved and survived and were resilient in deciding that they were going to not just live, but thrive in a place that was never meant for them. And that it is a privilege to be able to tell their stories. It's a privilege to be able to be a descendant who's able to tell their stories day in and day out. And at the very least that we can do, because those people survived and loved and lived long enough, they would have a child, who had a child, who had a child, who had me. And the very least that I can do is to be able to shout their stories, because I have a distinct love for not just them as individuals, but what they were able to survive, what they were able to pull through, and what they were able to create. And that is the uniqueness of African-American culture in the United States, and largely our biggest export as United States citizens. What I'll also say is that I hope that listeners and readers allow for students to be brave, to create spaces that allow for students to ask hard questions, even when it hurts, even when it's challenging to you as an individual or to you as a collective. Asking hard questions is how our students are able to create spaces that make change. And we have to give them the room to be that. Like Miss Lolita was just saying, we have to model that change for them. And that means that we have to be brave too in the middle of really hard moments. So I challenge all of you to be brave, because our next generation needs us to be brave so that they can be brave.
And Lolita, can you follow?
I will. And it's quite simple to me. To vow to do your part from wherever you are to make this nation a better place for the next generation.
Thank you for that. And I think we lost Jalaya. There she is. Okay.
You didn't lose me.
Okay. What is the one of the most important things you'd like people to take away from your fabulous perspectives article, where you make connections that aren't normally made?
I want to read this line. I think it's the first sentence of the last paragraph. We are in another iteration of the great exchange of power and justice. We are still in this fight, y'all. We are still doing this. It is not over. We have to, I think you just said it, we have to do our part, but we are still in another iteration of what that looks like. And we have a chance to shape it. And so let's stand up, let's own our brave spaces, let's own our seats of power, and let's do what needs to happen to shape what the next iteration of democracy, of reconstruction, of justice, of liberation, of all those terms, what it looks like based on our time and space in this place. And that's the power of place. We have the place now, and in our various physical spaces and places, but also in this place in the moment of now. So let's shape together and let's build together. What an awesome time to be together and with the right people around the table.
Thank you all so much. We have some time now for questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, please feel free to do so. You, again, can use the Q&A. I see that Linda Hansberry has your hand raised. Linda, you can go ahead with your question.
There we go. I just wanted to say more of a comment. I really appreciate Learning for Justice and you offering these types of webinars, seminars, workshops. I did visit the Whitney Plantation on the tour through Louisiana, Mississippi, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to going again. So I really just wanted to say that I appreciate not only Learning for Justice and reading the magazine and everything, but also the immersive learning experience. I think that's very important. And so I just give kudos to you all for that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda, for that comment. We have time for more questions. I had a question. I wanted to know what each of you were thinking as you wrote those articles. As a person who writes myself, right, I'm always motivated by something in particular that makes me move to paper. So I'd like to know from each of you, what were you thinking about when you started crafting your work? Whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'll say I am a product of my grandparents. I was raised by my grandparents. And I noticed that everything that I began to write or I think about is centered around one of them. Those were really fun times for me. There were a lot of fun memories. A lot of people don't like to reflect because they think of all of the bad times. But history is history and you can't erase it. So I thought about the love that was shown through them and their love for community, which helped to mold and to shape me into the person that I am, for loving those around me. So that's what I thought about.
I think for me, one, I was thinking about, well, how do I boil down all the work that we do here into something that isn't a huge tome, right? Into something that people are actually going to read. But also just trying to understand why is it that telling this history from this perspective is a radical act, and why that's something that is not necessarily easily introduced in your own classroom, but is a tool for you in your own classroom and in your liberatory educational work. And so, just a reminder that, not every place can be a Whitney, not every state, city, or whatnot has a direct connection to a space like ours, but there are a lot of amazing museum professionals that are doing similar work right now. And I'm sure that if you did a little work to see who's around you, that there are some really great people that you could call on to be resources for you in your classroom. So that was one of the things that I was trying to introduce in this article.
For me, Crystal, and all, I think I was taking for granted that what I've been learning and what I've been exposed to, that everyone else knew it. And so I was like, how do I be a teacher to people who I need to be in this work with, how I need to stand within this work together? How do I make those connections? And I just had a good time. Like, let's make connections. Let's just draw connections. Don't assume people know this. But, it doesn't mean we're less than if we don't know. It's just that those connections have been made in certain spaces, and there has been a privilege of being at certain tables and in certain learning environments and in certain opportunities that I had a chance to be a part of, that I'm able to now sit and let's frame this work and talk about it differently. So I was like, how do I share without like being too much and not being, it's kind of going over, but not being too wonky with it, but like be honest and say, y'all, this is what it is about. And this is what's happening right now in real time in front of us. How do we put words and language to it? So I want to give language to what we are experiencing and what is happening around us every day, and what we have to, and what our kind of call to action needs to be in the most real way that we can kind of digest it and kind of pick up our boots and go together. Because people know, but sometimes we don't have the language. And so I want to give language to what we are all experiencing and hearing. And so we can have some type of shared voice together around this.
Thank you all for your answers. We do have a question from Skyla Hudson, and it has to do with what we've talked about just recently, and it went away. Let's see. Oh, here it is. Do you have any recommended reading for educators who'd like to dive deeper into this topic of power and place? And I know, Amber, you shared resources from the Whitney Plantation, and I know that Learning for Justice has multitudes of resources about power and place. I want to mention something that really stood out for me in terms of power and place. And actually, this last issue of Learning for Justice is one thing I would recommend all educators and everyone who wants to indulge or dive deeper in, immerse themselves in the topic of power and place. Amber, one of the things that stood out for me the most in your piece was when you talked about how when teenagers stand in the space where people lived, and you could see the change come over their faces in terms of understanding this history and their connection to it. I think that was particularly powerful for me. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I would recommend everyone who's interested in this topic to pick up this magazine. It's actually online, and you will also be able to, and we'll share that in the chat. You can subscribe to have the magazine sent to you, not only to your school, but to your home.
Crystal, may I add a reading as well?
Yes.
That's been just inspirational, as I thought. One, of course, I quoted Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, but I specifically quote chapter 1. Chapter 1 of that talks about the rebirth of caste, and it shows the ebb and flow of justice and power, backlash, collective power, backlash, collective power. So that's a good power grounding conversations, that chapter. And again, I like Howard Zinn's The People's History. I think it's a section. It's the actual narratives are one, but it's the actual the book itself, and I think it's like chapter 25, but it's the coming of the revolt, the coming revolt of the prisoners and the guards, and it's showing how guards of a system now needs to let go and come and join and revolt with the prisoners of systems. And it's just a beautiful way of he explains how power works in this country and the interchange of power. So I would recommend Howard Zinn's Coming Revolt of People. I think it's chapter 25, and of course, first chapter of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow.
I have an addition, and this is probably linked in our in Whitney Plantation's resource list that I did drop in the chat. There are a couple of documentaries I would highly recommend. One of 13th, which is obviously an Ava DuVernay book, but based around the 13th Amendment and how the end of slavery actually didn't end slavery, right? And how there's one particular group that still can legally be enslaved in the United States, and those are people who are incarcerated, which then leads us to that entire, just like Jalaya was just talking about, this entire system of injustice. I would also recommend you look at The Neutral Ground, which is about the argument over Confederate monuments in New Orleans. It came out in about 2015, 2016 through PBS. It is an excellent documentary talking about how, in many ways, we're still fighting the Civil War in many places, because ultimately it's all about narratives and how particular narratives get promoted and particular narratives get laid aside. So thinking about history as a practice of power, and how even to this day we continue to do things, and what we can do as educators and as concerned citizens to be thinking about how we can be challenging narratives every day.
And for Mississippi, I would recommend Redemption by Nicholas Lehman.
Thank you all for that information. I need to wrap us up here, even though we could sit here all afternoon and have more fruitful conversation. I need to ask folks to mark their calendars for the next summer read along, which is August 16th. I need to note that Teaching Hard History and Critical Practices for Social Justice cohort applications open July 31st. I need to let you know to visit our LFJ website to explore our resources, and that I've mentioned those before. And that's where you can actually sign up to receive LFJ magazine. And I'd like to thank our fabulous panelists today, both for your powerful words in print and for your words here today. Appreciate your participation more than we could say. And thank tech support. And most of all, thank you, the audience. And for the audience, we would like to ask you to complete an evaluation before exiting this afternoon. And I think they will drop that link in the chat for you to complete that evaluation. So we are at time. And once again, it's been such a pleasure to have all of you here today. And again, it's such a pleasure to be able to go back to your work and pick it up at any time, just to be inspired and fight another day. So thank you, everyone. And we're going to say goodbye now.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.